The United States absolutely has a history of creating legislation that prevents folks from having children. But what I feel must be stated more so than that is that the United States has forcibly imposed a lot of horrific reproductive harms against various populations: Black folks, Native Americans, other folks of color, poor folks, folks with disabilities, to kind of say the least. These groups have faced many crimes against their bodies, regardless of legislation that should have been there to protect us, or within the presence of legislation that was purposely put in place to harm us. This book behind me does a really great job of explaining that. It's called Killing the Black Body, written by Dorothy Roberts, on race, reproduction, and the meaning of liberty. I do not have my copy with me, unfortunately, so I will not be able to quote it directly, but I want to try to sum this up. So just starting off strong with the institution of slavery and the eradication of Native American populations. I mean, anything that the United States government was doing and allowing to happen did not necessarily have legislation behind it. But of course, we know all of the practices that went into maintaining the, enslaved populations were really horrific and really centered around reproduction. They bred us on those plantations. They took away any ability or right to choose whether or not you wanted to have a child, or who you would have a child with, or how that child would come into existence. A tool for the ethnic cleansing of Native American populations in the United States was forcible sterilization. So Native American women would be forcibly sterilized so that they could not continue having children. And then, we see what has happened with the Native American population over the centuries. It had devastating effects very quickly. Aside from the fact that then the children that were already born to Native American populations were then forcibly removed from their parents and forced into the boarding schools that, especially in recent years, we have found to be even more heinous than what we knew previously. Moving further into the 20th century, eugenics was on the rise. And so there were a bevy of laws that were specifically passed that allowed forced sterilization of certain groups. That included not only racial groups, but also folks with disabilities and folks who were poor. In the 20s and 30s, we saw a rise of mental health asylums or insane asylums, and the women in those facilities were, both men and women. Men were forcibly castrated, women were also chemically sterilized, and unfortunately, those folks were also just being tormented in the name of research. Anti-miscegenation laws, such as banning interracial marriage, is also a form of preventing folks from having children, and an example of the state deciding your reproductive future for you. Even a lot of the sodomy laws were created to determine who you could or could not have sexual relations with, thus determining who you could or could not bear a child with. Even as far into the 1990s, I believe she has an example from 2003, but like I said, I don't have the book, so I don't hold me to that. County level judges would sentence people from those aforementioned groups, Black folks, folks of color, folks who are poor, folks who had disabilities. Part of their sentence could be that they were forced on birth control if they were not just forcibly sterilized. Norplant was commonly used. It was one of the first implant birth controls that hit the market. It was developed in the 60s and 70s. It started having international use in the 80s, and by the mid to late 80s, early 90s, the United States was using it for this purpose for sure. Now, aside from the side effects that we typically see with birth control, Norplant was especially dangerous because it tended to migrate throughout the body. There were accounts in this book of women who had to have it surgically removed from various places throughout their abdomen because of its, migration. This would be for very minor, very petty crimes such as, and I'm going to say crimes in heavy quotes because we know that these populations are also heavily over-policed and face a bevy of injustices within our system. From the 1930s to the 1960s, thousands of Puerto Rican women were forcibly sterilized without their knowledge or their consent. They were going into to receive care, just like regular, preventative care, or so they thought. And these United States doctors were forcibly sterilizing them for the purposes of ethnic cleansing. Now, the reason that we see anti-abortion laws is because politicians or the United States government, they do want certain people to have children and they don't want certain people to have children. But they want to be able to make that decision, not us. The same reason they're coming after birth control, sexual health education, and all of the other things in that realm. Now, in order to address some of your other comments, we would have to get more into the differences and the definitions and differences of reproductive justice, reproductive freedom, and reproductive rights. Very quickly, reproductive rights refers more to the legality of reproductive decision making. Reproductive freedom refers more to the ability of an individual to make well-informed reproductive health decisions without coercion. Now, reproductive justice, which is what I am talking about, does have 4 very specific tenets. Here's where you need to pay attention. Those 4 tenets include the right to bodily autonomy, the right to have children, the right to not have children, and also the right to raise those children with dignity and respect and safety. Now, right now, because the thing that we are currently dealing with, the most pressing issue, is anti-abortion laws, that's the thing that a lot of folks are really focused on, and they kind of forget about, and then also maybe bodily autonomy, but they kind of forget about those other 2. They forget that we also are fighting for the right for people to have children, and then also to raise those children with dignity and respect and safety. You cannot have one without the other 3. The reason why is what I laid out in the video prior to this, because then you have to ask who gets to make that decision and why is that person the most qualified person to make that decision. In the current United States system, the person or the entity making that decision is usually white supremacy. It usually lies in eugenics. It's usually anti-poverty, which is especially cruel, and a system specifically designed to keep certain groups in poverty. You also said that you don't think a mother's joy should be considered when thinking about whether or not someone should or should not have children. So, of course, there's that should or shouldn't thing again that we really cannot, no one can really say who should or should not have a child. However, the reason that I specifically bring up a mother's joy is because it goes into that 4th and final tenet of having the right to raise children with dignity and respect and safety. We're getting close to the 10-minute mark here, so I'll have to make a video to go more in depth about that. But alas, that is how the conversation surrounding Cardi B's pregnancy is very, very important to the current conversation that we are having about reproductive justice and freedom and rights in this country currently. No one has the right to tell you whether you should or should not have children. And under the capitalistic system that we live in, your choices are going to have consequences, but that does not mean that anybody should be able to tell you what to do. Definitely not the state, and definitely not some rando on the internet. And if you stayed here, let me know if you want to know more.